So I'm going to be talking just about the presidential election, and I'm really going to be talking about it from the point of view of voters. So it's really mass-based. I'm not going to really talk much about the campaign. And this is going to be very selective and very preliminary and honestly somewhat on the primitive side, but hopefully it'll kind of open the subject up. And so let's start with the fact that Ukraine has now had two elections in just a few months in a country that's had a lot of elections. I haven't totaled them up, but I suspect that Ukraine has had more elections. It certainly has had more contested elections than any other country in this entire region. It's now working on its sixth president, so we're looking here at the election of May 25th, 2014, in which Poroshenko was elected. And so one point that we were very interested in our survey work was about how people were perceiving, in particular, the legitimacy and fairness of the election and the elections. So what I'm going to be discussing in my allotted 10 minutes is based on survey work that a number of us have been doing in Ukraine since April. Our Ukrainian partner is sitting right to my left, Mr. Panioto and his Kiev International Institute of Sociology. There are four of us altogether, me and three others, Nadia Kravets, who is here, Ola Onok, who is not here, and Henry Hale from George Washington University, who's not here either. What we have been undertaken is a panel survey. And these are not the easiest things to do. You have to work with a very expert contractor, which we have been lucky enough to have. So panel simply means that you interview and then re-interview the same respondents, or at least as many of them as you can round up. And in a country that's in this sort of turmoil, of course, that was bound to be a difficult exercise, and we've done reasonably well. So we started with quite a large sample of more than 2,000 voters, and we interviewed them before the May 25th election. We then re-interviewed as many of them as Mr. Panioto and his team could find, which was about 1,400 or 1,450. Would have been better to have had more than that, but under the circumstances, I think we can be pleased with what we got. And we also do have funding to do one more wave after the Rada election, so that'll be starting very soon. If anybody here, I can't make any promises, but if anybody has a question, a hit the home run question that you would just love to hear the answer, what Ukrainians think about one thing, then please feel free to be in touch with me, and we'll see what we can do. I mean, it's already, it's survey research, it's kind of like launching satellites. You have a payload, and just so many ounces you can squeeze on. But if anybody has the desire to do that, then please be in touch. We're going to try and make this data available to the whole community sooner rather than later. We don't have an exact timetable, but by the end of the year for sure, maybe sooner, we'll try and find a way to make it accessible to anybody else to use. So we don't want to privatize it. The funding for this came from the National Science Foundation in the U.S., as well as a number of other sources in lesser amounts, including the Harvard Ukrainian Institute. Okay, so let's just start with a question of fairness. I think this is rather encouraging to think this is only about the presidential election, but despite all that went on in the months before it, the country held an election of a head of state, which most Ukrainians actually think was a fair election. Objectively speaking, I think it probably was just about as good as could have been done under the circumstances. So about 2/3 of all Ukrainians said yes, it was either very fair, perfectly fair, or quite fair. And only about 10 or 12% thought that the election was unfair. So that whoever won the election, I think that has to be counted, as a plus. So when you think about what happened between February 21st and May 25th in just 3 months, it's kind of hard to think of a setting that could have been more disrupted and messed up in terms of having an election. So I don't need to tell the people here everything that happened. Losing territory, an insurrection in the east of the country, extreme economic difficulties, the remover, I think, of many of the orienting points that would be found in a stable democratic political system to help individual citizens make choices. So this is just for your information. I think it's relevant to our general topic here, is what Ukrainians right now make about the two great upheavals of the last decade, the Orange Revolution of 2004, and then this year's Euromaidan events. And as you can see, not surprisingly, retrospective evaluations of the Orange Revolution tend to be more negative than positive, although they are not uniformly negative. And it's even possible that, you know, they have become more favorable, less unfavorable over the last 6 months, but I don't know that for a fact. However, when it comes to this year's events, then actually it's the reverse so far. So a plurality of Ukrainians think that this year's revolution, the overthrow of Yanukovych, did more good than harm. But it's not a majority. It's just a plurality. As you can see, a third of Ukrainians are willing to say, well, some harm and some good, which I myself think that's correct. Only about 20% say that it did more harm than good. But it's going to be very interesting to see as we track this, does that right column tend in the direction of the left column? I certainly hope not, but we shall see. I have all these devices here. I put this together this morning because I realized we had a couple of questions on here that we have asked in precisely the same wording in Russia. It goes without saying, when you're doing survey work in Ukraine, you have to use Ukrainian and Russian languages. So in fact, it just depended on the wish of the respondent which language the question was read out in. And this is general attitudes towards democracy and also strongman rule. And as you can see here, respondents were asked, do you think a democratic system would fit well with the needs of your country, of Ukraine? We'd asked the very same question in Russia in 2012, and I also think we might have asked it earlier, like 2000 or something like that. But the readings in Russia are actually quite stable. But you notice here there's quite a gap. So almost 70% of Ukrainians think that democracy, make that 65% of Ukrainians think that democracy, a democratic system, fits very well or fairly well with Ukraine's needs. In Russia, that figure is, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with the two screens. In Ukraine, it's about 60, about 2/3. In Russia, it's the main difference is in terms of very good fit. I mean, actually, Russians seem to be almost as committed to the word democracy as Ukrainians are, although, of course, political practice in Russia is very different. We also asked the same respondents a second question, which was, so, all right, so you told us about democracy. Tell us what you think about the idea of your country having a strong leader who doesn't have to worry about democratic hassles like parliament and elections. What would you think of that? So in Russia, a majority actually favor a strong leader who doesn't have to worry about parliament and elections, even though many Russians also, in fact, the plurality of Russians favor democracy. That's contradictory. In Ukraine, certainly the proportion of people who favor a strong man is less than it is in Russia. But I would say if you looked at that left-hand column, not knowing the right-hand column existed, you might think this wasn't the best news exactly. Because almost 40% of Russians say, Ukrainians, I beg your pardon, citizens, say that they think Ukraine should have a strong leader who doesn't have to worry about parliament elections. Now, these two things, of course, would seem to be contradictory. There have been some efforts to try and reconcile them, this data when it comes to Russia. Henry Hale wrote a paper on that not long ago. But I would just observe here that a quarter of the respondents in the Ukrainian sample that Mr. Panagiota put together, 26% endorsed both democracy and rule by a strongman. So that's something to file away for future reference. But to get back to orienting points, so, I mean, Ukrainians look to their recent political past. They see, well, a lot of upheaval, a lot of confusion, a lot of disappointment, promises that weren't delivered on. So what, on what basis would they make their electoral decisions? Now, this is dangerous territory here. You know, normally, when you're analyzing or studying mass political behavior, you don't ask people to explain why they did something. It's just generally believed that this is the so-called lay scientist approach. You can't really count on people to understand why they did something, or to put it in their own words in particular. We've tried to do this in Russia the odd time. Why did you vote for United Russia? Well, my sister said it would be a good idea. Or if you ask people to just come up with something off the top of your head, it doesn't say very much. So this is, there would be purists who would say this is not admissible in court. But nonetheless, I thought it was kind of interesting. We asked these questions, and we will ask them again for the Rada election. Now, just to mention one negative here, in terms of what doesn't seem to count, in terms of, so this was a closed list. We read it out to the respondents. We didn't ask them to volunteer. In terms of what clearly doesn't seem to matter at all, the really striking row here is the one having to do with political parties. And now, why is that? You know, Ukraine actually had a fairly stable party equilibrium for a whole decade, anchored around the Party of Regions and Tymoshenko's party with its various names. But you know, it was basically destroyed over the past year. The Party of Regions is barely there's barely a pulse there, and Tymoshenko and Batkovshchina have sunk to almost nothingness. And so far, there's really very little to take its place. So I can tell you, of the people who voted for Poroshenko, almost nobody said they did it because of his party. And I think that's true because, well, his party, the bloc, Poroshenko bloc, largely existed on paper. Okay, so a couple of interesting things about this table, and this is, you know, more proper statistical modeling of the voting decision is something that we're going to be doing later. But you'll notice a few things here. One of them is that personal qualities really seem to count a lot, which is, I guess, not surprising. When parties are more or less irrelevant to the decision, personalities matter, and that applies to Poroshenko, in fact, to all of the candidates pretty well, but especially to Lyashko. So I think here this self-reporting is picking up something quite interesting. In the case of Lyashko, there's also the protest factor. We want to send a message, you know, that kind of thing. But I'll mention just one thing about Poroshenko. He is the one, in terms of self-assessments, where voters give the most variegated picture. It doesn't seem to be just the one thing. In the case of Lyashko, it's basically personality and protest. In the case of Tymoshenko, it's basically personality and her past record. So she's become kind of historicized, right? She's something from the past. People know about what she's done before, are not interested, particularly in most cases, and are not going to vote for her. Poroshenko, though, gets a much more diverse array of responses. But notice that bottom line. I think that's really interesting. 20% of Poroshenko voters said the main reason they voted for him was they thought he would win in the first round. And almost nobody said that about any other candidate. So if it's true that 20% of his 55% were people who voted for him just because they thought they would be spared a second round of the election and further instability, then, you know, if they hadn't thought that, they would have voted for somebody else, and he would have been forced into a runoff. Now, this is very speculative, I realize, but had that happened, it would have been against, I guess, either Lyashko or Tymoshenko. He would have won, most likely, almost certainly he would have won. But his opponent's standing in the system, I think, would have turned out to be much higher than turned out to be the case for these two, who became pretty well irrelevant once Poroshenko had been installed. A second round where they would have got 30 or 35% of the popular vote would have put them, I think, in the role of potential prime minister or kingmaker, something like that. Yatsenyuk, I don't think, would necessarily be prime minister today if this had happened. So I thought that was an instructive slide. I'll say one final thing about Poroshenko. So we have a lot of information about the social background characteristics of the voters. We know how old they were, what sex they were, obviously, what kind of work they do, their family income situation, their education level. We know what region of the country they're from, of course. And in terms of the vote for Poroshenko, my general impression from wrestling with this for a couple of weeks is that actually the connections between social background and vote for him are quite weak. They're not non-existent. So he did rather better among older voters, among somewhat better off voters, somewhat better educated voters, and he did poorly in the East and in the South. And now there's the abstention factor there, which Sergei has written about, which is really important, and the spoiled balance is a whole other subject. the regional pattern is clear. The other things you can only get at through survey analysis. My very last point is that region, we'll find ourselves, I think, talking about regionalism, we always do when we talk about Ukrainian politics. That one of the things that I hadn't really expected was that when you have individual level information, you're not just working with aggregate data, and you are able to do, let's say, a regression analysis involving an indicator of region, macro region, west, south, northeast, or something like that, west, south, center, east. And if you have information about language, and of course there are many ways that can be measured, but let's say language used in private affairs as opposed to the workplace, or if you want native language, something like that. And if you have information also about ethnicity, nationalnost. The one factor that seems to trump the others in preliminary analysis is actually region. And I guess I hadn't entirely expected that, because Dominique has told us so much in his work about the importance of language in Ukrainian politics. We've sometimes thought that these regional indicators were kind of proxies for more fundamental, say, linguistic or ethnic markers, but it's starting to look, at least on the basis of this election, as if region per se has a larger independent effect than maybe we've sometimes given it credit for in the past. So I'll have to stop at that, and I look forward to questions.